Hello and welcome to Sharing the Light. We are so glad you're joining us today here at the Sunshine Cathedral in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. We're glad to be joined as always by our senior pastor, Reverend Dr. Durrell Watkins, and also with Reverend Diaz with us today. Today's topic, we're going to be looking at atonement and what does that mean for us as we live our lives in the 21st century. So, Dr. Watkins, how do we begin this discussion today on atonement?
Well, atonement theories, and I'm always, I hate that we call it atonement theory because we don't treat our religious theories like theories. We don't try to disprove them. We don't have a thesis and an antithesis or an antithesis. We don't start out with a hypothesis and then try to disprove the hypothesis and then what we come up with is theory. We don't do it in a sort of a scientific way. So really, what we have when we're talking about our atonement theories, or most of our theological theories, are just our opinions or our hypotheses or the traditions that we've developed. So, but when we're talking about atonement theory, there's not just one. In Christianity, atonement theory has developed over forever, and it started, of course, with the belief that somehow human beings needed to be reconciled with the divine, that somehow God was displeased with us. And so what could we do to sort of bridge that gap, to sort of make amends, to sort of fix that? And so it comes from a theistic view of God, where God is sort of like a person with a personal ego, and that God is sort of far and removed and distant and judgmental. And it also has a low view of human nature. And so it's trying to reconcile this faraway and angry God with these lowly humans. And so that's where the atonement theories come in, is that they try to bridge that gap. Origen, a guy named Origen, very, very early on in Christian tradition, but still way after Jesus, came up with the ransom theory, which was that sort of human beings lived in a sinful state because of the fall, and so Jesus died as a ransom for humanity. Because of humanity's sinful state, really we belong to nefarious forces, the devil maybe, and so Jesus sort of or God made sort of a deal with the devil. I'll give you my son, and then you'll give me back humanity. And so Jesus dies, and the devil is all happy. But God sort of is a trickster in the story, and Jesus doesn't stay dead. So God gets everything. God gets his son back and humanity. And so that's the ransom theory. It's sort of an odd theory. Anselm, about 900 years later, he decided he didn't like that, so he came up with the satisfaction theory. And he was part of the aristocracy, so he saw God as a big aristocrat and autocrat. And so he still saw human beings as being sinful, and this sinful nature was sort of a betrayal of God. And God had to have God's wrath satisfied. But who could do that? Nobody could do that. But Jesus was good enough that he could satisfy God's wrath. And so Jesus' death then becomes an atonement for God's wrath, and that makes us all okay. Abelard, shortly thereafter, he comes up with the moral theory of atonement, which was that Jesus lived in such a way that he was willing to die if that's what it took for him to get his message out and to live with integrity. And as followers of Jesus, we are inspired by that model to live with such moral integrity. And it's then by our moral integrity that is inspired by Jesus' life and death that is salvific. And Abelard, in his day, called a heretic, is sort of the inspiration for liberal Protestant theologians. But then there's also Calvin and Luther during the Protestant Reformation. They came up with a penal theory, which was that sin has real consequences. It's very similar to the satisfaction theory. And then the liberation theologians of the 20th century saw Jesus' death as suffering with people who suffer, like the poor. And so Jesus isn't trying to necessarily reconcile us to God. Jesus is sort of being God with the people who already suffer. And so there's all these various theories of atonement throughout the ages. All of them have biblical proof texts. None of them are very biblically solid. And I think all of them would have been foreign to how Jesus understood himself and his mission. The truth is, Jesus died because he was executed, like a lot of people, even on that very day, by the Roman government. He wasn't the first person to be killed. He wasn't the last person. He wasn't the only person that day to be killed. He wasn't the last person in the Christian movement, which at that time wasn't even called Christian, to die. And so he died because of the evil of imperialism. And then people who were sad about that tried to make sense of it. And so making sense, one of the ways that they've made sense of his death is to say it had a purpose, and the purpose was to reconcile us to God. In the 21st century, if we have a higher view of human nature, and because of post-Darwinian understandings of evolution, we don't think we started high and fell. We think we started low and are constantly evolving. And so if we have a view of God as being good and a view of humans as being good, then none of those old atonement theories really sort of hold water for us today. And so another possible understanding we can say, and sort of the New Thought movement demonstrated this for us in the 19th century and 20th century, is that Jesus understands the omnipresence of God. That he and God are one, and all of us are one with God because God is everywhere. Two things can't occupy the same place at the same time. So if God is everywhere, that means that we must be somehow an expression of God. If God is omnipresent, then we are part of God, and God is good. And so Jesus understands this and models this, and so Jesus' life and teachings are what remind us of our at-one-ment with God, which is the atonement. Now that message was something a lot of people didn't want to hear. He's executed in the hearts of the faithful. He doesn't stay dead. That's resurrection. But I think for liberal, progressive, modern Christians, atonement can boil down to the understanding that we are innately at one with a good God. And Jesus is one of the people who show us that way.
Michael, you want to get a quick reading on this?
Well, I think whenever you're dealing with issues of atonement, I think my own perspective is that you have to really understand why the early church really understood issues of atonement and maybe came to that theory because of the context of sacrifice in ancient Israel, the context of the society at large at that time. And so the question that we now have to have as people who live in the 21st century is, was there ever a gulf between humans and God? And if we're willing to ask that and answer and say no, then we have to go with this more developed. We're good enough humans already. We don't need the death. We don't need bloodshed in order for us to be in right relationship with the divine.
There's one more aspect to that also, and that is that all of this thinking really develops after the destruction of the Jewish temple and the destruction of Jerusalem, which is where the temple sacrifices were made. Well, once there's no more temple, there's no more temple sacrifices. And so another way of sort of mourning the loss of the temple is to say, well, we don't need sacrifices anymore because we had this one big one. And so we can live without the temple now because the big one took it. So I mean, it was really all in a context that is very different than the context in which we live our lives.
Well, thank you both for being here today, and thank you for joining us here on Sharing the Light.